Yes, yeah. It's trying to derive a metric of what is a good claim, essentially. It's I think I showed it to you before, Jonathan. It's a two-dimensional representation of how you can determine whether or not something is a good terminal claim indeed.
Maybe quickly share it into the screen so it's in the recording.
I will. I will screen share. Can you see it?
Yep.
So it's two-dimensional in the sense that it's derived based on two measures. So if you have any claim, positive and negative consensus is the easy one. It's simply how many people believe in it. No roll-up scoring, no whatsoever. Simply the Earth is flat. How many people say yes? How many people say no? Like, yes, I believe the Earth is flat. No, the Earth is not flat, essentially. With me so far?
Yep.
Then the horizontal axis is a bit more complicated. I call it a bias towards one way or the other in terms of arguments. For each supporting claim, that would be counted as one towards a bias towards supporting. For each opposing claim, it would be +1 for a bias towards opposing. But this is rolled up. So if you have a opposing claim against a supporting argument, that would also be an opposing claim. So if you have one supporting argument with one opposing argument in turn, then the rolled up score would be 1-1, meaning there is no bias, it's neutral, it's in the middle. It's not leaning one way or the other. Yes, Marc-Antoine?
How do you, that's something that often interests me, how do you count opposition to opposition? Because opposition to opposition is not always support. Do you count it as support?
Well, no, I count it as bias towards supporting arguments or not. For me, it's all about how bias here refers to how much has one side or the other of a topic been discussed. Right. So it's really about like the depth of conversation, I call it as well. Like how much has.
But, sure, but you said an opposed to a support is counted as an opposed, which I totally agree with. Mm-hmm. I guess support of support is counted as support, mm-hmm. Maybe. But is support of oppose is obviously counted as oppose, that's fine, but is oppose of oppose counted as support?
Because, no, as oppose. Wait, no, as support, yeah.
Yeah, you do count it as support. I'm saying it ain't necessarily so, right?
Can you give an example where you would argue it isn't?
Well, basically, I may say this is a irrelevant argument, so I'm opposing the oppose, but that doesn't mean that I support.
Yes, but then you're digging into relevance, and that gets trickier. Do you want to count all of them or only those that are relevant? But
yeah, or maybe I'm even saying this is relevant but false. This is not a valid argument. I still believe in the conclusion, but this is not a valid argument. So this is not even relevance.
Yeah, but so the scoring indeed of arguments on relevance will be treated differently than scoring on.
No, but what I'm saying is even without relevance, a support of support is not necessarily, oppose of oppose is not necessarily support.
It is, because you mentioned the relevance case.
No, but now I'm saying even without relevance, forget relevance, please. And if I'm opposing something, somebody opposes something, and then I'm saying, no, that's a bad argument, it's false. It's false, the premise is false. You're opposing, the premise of your opposing claim is false. I still agree with you that the ultimate conclusion is false, but not for that reason.
You can also get a kind of paradoxical result where someone makes a really bad argument, and then you have people from both sides with counter arguments saying why this is a terribly bad argument. And if you interpret those as all arguments for one side, that could warp the results.
But they are essentially arguments that one way or another contribute to the final. It doesn't mean it determines unilaterally the final conclusion. Yes, you can still disagree, but again, it's just a metric, a rolled-up metric that says overall, if you would have to put them in one category or the other, where it definitely isn't the opposite, right? It's definitely an opposing an opposing argument to an opposing argument is definitely not a support, right? It's definitely not an argument to say, oh, the fundamental conclusion we're trying to make is true. It is a piece of information, a piece of argumentation that was added overall as an opposing argument. It doesn't mean that means that you don't believe the conclusion to be true. That's separate.
Where I agree with you is I get the impression this axis is about how well were both sides considered.
Exactly.
And that way, an opposed to oppose is a bias towards supporting.
Exactly.
It shows that, and there I agree totally with you.
So, and there are flaws with it. The underlying premise that I think Bentley pointed out is totally valid. If I can pull it up, I can read it. But then I can go over with that assumption. Was it in Hangouts? Or was it in general? Yes, here Bentley said, and that's correct. This assumes that in most cases there is relatively equal reasons, evidence to support or oppose arguments, and thus an imbalance is due to a lack of health, as opposed to a difference in supporting opposing bias being due to the availability, existence of accurate evidence and reasons on one side or the other. That's a whole lot stated. It's easy to comprehend, I think, in when you read it. But it simply says, yeah, it assumes that there's always equal number of things to be said on both sides. And if that's the case, then it's healthy, because what this two-dimensional thing is aiming for is indeed you want healthy terminal claims, which means that an equal amount of things have been said for it than against, yet still the majority believes in the conclusion that it's true. The opposite of that is deemed false by the majority, and both sides have been considered equally. And then the cases, what we definitely don't want is that you only have supporting arguments. There's nobody arguing otherwise, yet everyone believes in it. That's very common as well. I would argue that most arguments on the internet are like this, and that I would call populist. That's equally problematic. And then the other two corners are a bit weird. If you consider them, it means that everyone believes in it, but they have only been arguing against it. They've only been arguing against it, yet everyone believes in it. That's a really weird state to be in. I actually don't know how that would even happen. And well, the interesting thing about this spectrum is
it's
well,
very
it would
easy.
happen in the example we talked about, where someone makes a bad argument, and everyone argues against the bad argument. And so,
yeah, but then that would be counted as supporting. I think the more likely case
no,
is
it would be accounting it as supporting or opposing, depending on which side the bad argument is on.
If everybody opposes the bad opposing argument, all those are counted as bias towards supporting. So we will move towards bias.
Right, but if everyone opposes the bad supporting argument, those are biased towards opposing. And so there's
no,
the problem.
They're biased towards supporting the target.
So okay, let's have a concrete example. The world is round. Large amount of support. Somebody says the world is round because an angel told me in a dream. You know, and then there's like a big argument.
So that's not an opposing argument. That's a pro argument.
Yes. Yeah, but that's accurate. I mean, yes. So the entire discussion so far has been about something irrelevant. Everyone is but then it's still. I mean, everyone will start arguing, well, that's irrelevant, blah 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 blah. So there's a bias towards.
No. People will say it's irrelevant, so they'll oppose the support, and by opposing the support, it counts as bias towards opposing argument. It's a good example. He's right. I have a simpler example, by the way.
Yeah, go ahead, because I didn't fully grasp it in my head yet.
Maybe finish then. It's worth making sure that this is clear.
So the claim on the consideration is the world is round.
Yeah. Somebody
Everyone
supports
it, but there's one person, so there's positive consensus.
Yeah.
But
and it starts out with, no arguments, right? So, and then the only person that makes an argument makes a bad argument, and it's a supporting argument. But it's a bad supporting argument.
Well, maybe ignorance isn't too bad of a label then, actually. It still means that, yeah, these labels are hard. Either way, it's still a bad state, right? I think in terms of labeling these sites, it might be weird. It's still a bad state. I don't know whether ignorance is the right name, but it's definitely not healthy either.
It's a bad state in that good arguments are missing.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. My case, my simple case was somebody makes a claim. Let's say it could even be a reasonable claim, and everybody agrees with it. And then there's a troll who starts making counter arguments, and the counter arguments are all bad, and nobody even bothers with them. So there's a bunch of these counter arguments. Nobody even bothered to put positive arguments because it's so obvious. Yep. And so you have a bias towards opposing argument, and everybody thinks it's true except the troll.
I think that's where relevance comes in, and where I wouldn't count irrelevant arguments at all. So I think there should be a cutoff point, but that's a deeper discussion into this metric. Okay. At some point, an argument is so irrelevant that it doesn't count in this scoring.
But one question about irrelevance. If I make a relevant argument based on false premise, an obviously false premise, for me, it's still relevant. It's just based on an obviously false premise. Would you count, does that fit with your notion of what relevance means?
Yeah, and then we can talk about how different ways of modeling that, right? For me, I remember that I equate relevance and what in this case would be multi-premise arguments, because on Socrates, for me, that would, yes, it would break the relevance. If it's based on, you would argue against it, you would say, well, that's irrelevant because of this other claim that's false. Most likely.
Yeah, I'm a bit uncomfortable with that in the sense that how do you distinguish a claim that's irrelevant because obviously false made in bad faith from a claim that's false made in good faith, and people start discovering counter arguments to it, and why isn't this true? It's not, that doesn't seem to be procedurally decidable.
Yeah, it would help to go through a couple of examples. Either way, that's the spectrum we're talking about.
Yeah. I think that's a good starting point. Of course, we'll want to do something like it's not just an addition subtraction, right? If there's 5 against 0, that's a bias. If there's 55 against 50, it's fine. Well, so I don't know if you have a way to do this, right? It's not the delta that's important. It's probably a relative percentage something.
So these are terminal nodes, you're saying. This is how we measure, classify terminal nodes. But a terminal node, I think by definition means there are no arguments for or
no, those are non-terminal nodes.
Well, all nodes would be treated the same here, but the fact is, if you have a node that you consider at any given point, if you have a terminal node, if everyone believes in it and there's no underlying arguments according to this metric, it will still show a bright green, meaning good. It's still healthy. If there's no disagreements, it's a good terminal node.
Got it.
Sounds right.
Right. If there's terminal node and there's no disagreement or universal disagreement, but there's unanimity, you say that's healthy. It's unhealthy if there's one argument for and 0 against.
Exactly, that's super unhealthy, because that means all of a sudden, apparently it's not a terminal node. Everyone believes in it, but there's obviously an argument against it hasn't been argued for otherwise. And then it goes a bit more towards Bentley's scoring mechanism.
But I think there can be healthy situations where there is only one argument. So simple example is somebody says, here's the average temperature, in San Francisco on this date. And somebody else says, no, that's incorrect. Here's the actual data with a link, to the NOAA website. And there's, one argument against, but it's very convincing. That argument has no arguments for or against. It is actually terminal.
I would argue it definitely has, because this is probably an argument from authority. So you would probably say, oh, well, that source is a reliable source and a final authoritative voice on the correct interpretation of temperature in that city. So definitely you can argue for that.
Yeah,
You
but
can,
people
but
won't
suppose you
bother.
haven't. So at some point, the argument always ends. And I think there will be situations where the argument does end on something that nobody contests, but is itself convincing.
There's a kind of propagation of health. If argument is non-terminal, but it's only being argued for or argued against by a few healthy nodes, then that argument is still healthy, I would say. It doesn't need consideration because it's only being argued for by healthy nodes. Wouldn't you think?
That's an interesting question. Not according to how I saw it, but I guess Jonathan is indeed arguing yes or not.
I think he is.
I would argue that this situation is potentially a very healthy situation. In fact, what I see very commonly happening, is a common misperception that is easily corrected. This is not always the case, but I see, for example, in misinformation on social media, someone spreads a rumor, and the rumor is something that spreads because people believe it's true. Maybe some people are maliciously spreading it, but it only really spreads a lot because people believe it's true. It seems plausible. They heard it, from someone they trust, so they believe it. But sometimes correcting a rumor is actually quite easy. It's as simple as somebody making the argument, actually, this is just a rumor. Here's, the actual facts in an article. And sometimes, and I think, or at least I hope frequently, that will be the end of it. People will recognize, oh yeah, okay, that's true. So this thing that I thought for no good reason other than people told me, now I have a reason, and now I change my opinion. And there doesn't need to be more discussion in some cases.
I'll go a bit further. I mean, let's face it, what's the really unhealthy situation here? It's when you have my view of the really unhealthy situation. It's not when you have only one-sided arguments that correspond with belief. It's when you have a polarization, like some people believe, some people don't believe, or a fringe belief. And okay, in the fringe belief, what's unhealthy is nobody bothered to correct it and give counter arguments. So that's one unhealthy situation. The work of saying why it should be fringe has not been done.
And it's not done because there's an echo chamber, and these people are not even being exposed to the information.
And in the case of polarizing belief, and let's assume that people are doing it in good faith. Like if people are doing it in bad faith and there's only, crappy arguments on one side, well, we know why that's unhealthy and it's easy-ish to detect. Like if we have a health measure, we can say, well, the situation is healthy because all the plausible evidence points on one side, and that accords to the belief. If it doesn't accord to if the belief doesn't match the weight of plausible evidence, then we have a problem of one kind. The other kind that's really interesting is when we have plausible evidence on both sides. And where you're right is when there is plausible evidence on both sides and the weight of belief is skewed. That is another form of unhealthy situation because people are ignoring plausible arguments on the other side. That is really, I think, what you're trying to measure, the unhealthiness you're trying to measure. Mm-hmm. But it does depend on the situation of there being plausible arguments on both sides. Because
it does. I'm just wondering what is the majority here? How common is it that there's not plausible argumentations on both sides?
It's very common.
The consensus always.
The point is, I spoke often of consensus beliefs because people believe align with reality.
Yeah, but that's a vertical axis. It doesn't mean that you can't think of counter arguments. Let's
Yeah,
say
but
concrete
you may
example.
not
What's a
bother to
very
put them.
clear?
You may not bother to put them, and that's
And they may
still
not add
healthy.
value to put, because the reality is the actual reasons that we have for our beliefs are countless. You know,
Exactly, but what's wrong with showing? I mean, it's a matter of interpretation, right? If you don't care that it is in this case, it might be labeled as a populist view, so be it. Who says that a populist view that everyone believes in and nobody argued against is bad? It's purely contextual at that point. It's more a manner of, in some contexts that might be bad, in others that might be not worth bothering about.
Yeah, but I mean, the question is what's healthy and unhealthy, right? And we're trying to identify the healthy and unhealthy situation. I think that consensus view without justifications can be healthy, can be unhealthy, but it becomes unhealthy when we have counter arguments. A consensus view with only arguments supporting the consensus, whether they support the argument or not, because maybe a consensus view is no when there's, that's also healthy. The problem is when you have a consensus view with opposing arguments. That is really the interesting point. Or
yeah, especially if those opposing arguments are not contested. So
yeah.
I think
But
it's
so that would be the ignorance spectrum, right? Let me.
Consensus
Trying to
view.
share. Yeah. So a consensus view with only opposing arguments is what I would call ignorance.
so.
Yeah.
So that is definitely an indication that the consensus view may be ignorant. Absolutely, yeah. So,
which is red for a reason, and populist indeed, which is I made it on purpose yellow because it's less bad than red, right? I mean, if a lot everyone believes in it, but there's only supporting arguments. Yeah, for me it does indicate honestly still a problem. There might be cases where you can argue, yeah, it's not a big deal because it's God knows, based on the context, it might matter. I'm interested to hear more concrete examples.
Some math topics, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. But then again, I don't want math in a discussion. For me, informal discussions and math are worlds apart.
But what I'm realizing is I do like what you're doing here, and I think it's very useful. Something that does bother me, I was going to do this measure on the arguments themselves, saying, hey, you personally, and also the group, but that's a different measure, you personally believe this, but here's an unanswered opposition to it, right? So there's an opposition and you have not given a counter to that opposition. You haven't given a rebuttal.
But this is more of a personal
it's a personal thing. But
what I'm presenting is more like a global.
But let me get into that. It can obviously be extended to the group. If the group believes, we can say, hey, the group believes this, and there's unrebutted counter argument. So there's we can speak about group belief. And what's important, the distinction I want to put here is putting it, I was going to put it on individual arguments, not on the target. Why is that? Because for me, if there's a bunch of opposing arguments, they've been rebutted, and the balance can be anywhere, but the question is, the rebutted arguments in a way don't count towards saying there's a problem. There's no problem if there's a bunch of opposing arguments and they've been rebutted. It's not unhealthy. And what is unhealthy is not the overall count, it's not the overall number, but the presence of unrebutted arguments. That is what's unhealthy.
So I was talking about the term justified opinion in our last call, and it's something I defined in my essay on distributed Bayesian reasoning, and it corresponds to what you've just described. So once somebody makes an argument contrary to the majority position or to your position, and you have not responded to that argument, or somebody hasn't responded to that argument, that position becomes unjustified.
Right.
And the position of the opposition now becomes justified. They've given a reason for disagreeing, whether they're disagreeing with the majority or the minority. They've given a reason, and therefore they've justified their opinion. And everyone else that hasn't justified their opinion. And it can be as simple as simply acknowledging, okay, yes, the premise of your argument is true, but it doesn't change my mind. Now you still have a justified opinion because you've at least acknowledged the argument that was made. Now you're justified. Now, if you make a counter argument, then the people whose opinion were previously justified based on the argument they made are no longer justified. And it's their turn to justify their opinion by responding to your counter argument.
But this all presumes turn taking.
No.
It does.
No.
Because who are these people at which point in time?
Yeah. Well, so if we don't count people and we only count arguments, I think the same sort of logic applies. So when somebody says, and by the way, I think you are talking about consensus here. This model is sort of a hybrid where you count how many people agree or disagree with the claim, and then you count the number of arguments for or against the claim and not the votes on those arguments. But either way, I think the same logic applies. Once someone has created a counter argument, unless there's a counter argument, there's an unjustified, well, there's always an unjustified opinion. But in the case of ignorance, it's when there is the number of people agreeing with the claim is a majority, and then there's a counter argument. And now your state of ignorance is my state of, where the majority opinion is not justified. My calculations would take into consideration counts, and I would count how many people agreed with that opposing argument. And then I'd use a Bayesian average to see how strong the evidence really is. And then calculate the justified opinion based on that.
The main point I think we're making is that individual argument status matters more than bulk of direction. The bulk of how many opposing, how many supporting overall. It's like if you have 20 rebutted oppositions, it doesn't add weight. It's the one unopposed opposition, unrebutted opposition that adds weight. And that's what I think Jonathan and I are both saying. Now, I'm not saying it's not interesting to have this metric. I think it is an interesting metric. But for me, it's subordinate to the, is there a single unrebutted opposition, which is another metric. But we did say we'd go multi-metric anyway.
So Bentley and I were talking about how you count number of arguments versus number of people. And we came up with a couple of examples. Let's say somebody submits 10 counter arguments. The same person submits 10 counter arguments. Or let's say 10 different people each submit one counter argument. Or a third case, let's say one person submits one counter argument, but 10 people vote on it. How do you evaluate those three separate situations? And I think they should be evaluated. Well, actually, two of them should be evaluated the same and one should be evaluated differently. But
it's interesting because it assumes that, yeah, you link the arguments to the contributors, whereas Timothy and I would agree, would be the first to say, no, content is content. It doesn't matter. Why does it matter who added it?
Well,
my answer
the point is canonicality, right? I mean, do you have a good, safe way to say this is the same argument made by two people, and then you don't care who made it, you just care how many people made it. But without canonicality.
Exactly.
So
we're assuming canonicality. We're assuming that irrelevant stuff gets removed. We're assuming that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you don't have a good. Yeah, then you need other mechanisms of dealing with that.
I do think it's important to keep the original, the creator. Here's why. It's because canonicality itself can be agreed or disagreed. I can say, oh, those two arguments look the same. And then the author should be able to say, no, it's different in this way. If somebody else says it,
Yeah,
well,
but
let them make a new argument.
at
right?
some point you need to say they're the same or not. Once the decision
Yeah.
is made that they're the same, that's when they're treated as
I
the
agree.
same.
So we are trying to remove, in a sense, subjectivity and still objectively score arguments, right? And it reminds me of a lot of the work in like argumentation frameworks, where generally you're not looking at how many people voted for or against an argument. You're just saying, hey, look, and it's sort of the same idea of a justified opinion. If someone says A and then someone argues B and there's no counter argument, you know, the classic, you know.
I think they're both relevant metrics. I mean, indeed, it's more like what you're arguing for is more like of the people that believe in this, so many people have a justified opinion ish. That's what you're saying. But I think it's orthogonal to the how much both sides have been considered. And as long as these metrics are transparent, which I always say they're understandable, it's somewhat clear to the user how they were derived, I see no issue. Then it's more like, yeah, how do you visualize them? Then it becomes a pure UX UI concern.
But that's really interesting. I like the idea of counting separately the people who believe or disbelieve something, which is still an interesting thing to know, right? It's still something I'd like to show, versus the people who have done so in a way that they're justified. That means they have left no counter argument dangling. Personally, they've acknowledged. And by the way, when you say acknowledge, Jonathan, that's something that bothered me a bit. It's not enough to say, oh, I acknowledge this, but it doesn't change my mind. I should be able to say it doesn't change my mind because maybe it's because it's true, but less weighty than this other argument, which is a perfectly valid thing, or, you know.
I've thought a lot about that, and I think that they're both important.
Okay.
Because they both give us information. You know, knowing that there's this really great, you know, argument B, and everyone that sees B, you know, agrees with it and changes their mind about A, right? And so often looking at what I call the informed opinion, you know, what people who have seen this argument believe versus what people who haven't seen this argument believe is interesting if there's a difference. But then you even have more information if somebody says, I agree with B, I still haven't changed my mind, and then here's why. Because what you've done now is you've changed in this model I've been developing what the justified opinion is. Now, you know, people that acknowledge B and agree that B is true have justified opinion whether or not they agree with A. But once you've submitted a counter argument, now you've changed the landscape of the argument. And now you've submitted new information. And now if people still disagree with A and haven't, because of B, but haven't looked at considered your new information, their argument is less justified.
Okay, a few things. First, I worry about bad faith. I worry about people saying, "Yeah, I've read that." Just check the box. Don't even bother to read it. And that's getting them to say why.
And it's not just reading it, so it's voting on it. But go on.
Yeah, but
it's taking a position, like, you know, and that's something often you do in argument. You say, "Hey, look, do you admit or do you recognize that this is the case?"
Yeah.
Because I actually don't even want to know your opinion until I know whether or not you agree in this basic fact.
Correct.
But go on.
Yeah, absolutely. But the other thing, the other little correction I would make to do, and I don't know how that impacts the notion of justified and unjustified. I could imagine very much a situation where you have competing goods, and, you know, I want to do A because it leads to consequence of A. I want to do A because it leads to B, and somebody else says, I want to do C because it leads to D. And should we do A or C? Well, I prefer B to D, or I prefer D to B. And once you've said that, I don't think you should have to justify preferences, right? You should be able to say, I think this is more important than that. I think that is more important than this. That's a preference. And that's my justification for choosing this action instead of that action. And this one doesn't, if you say, because C is more important to me than D, that's not destroying the justification of others. It's not adding information, it's adding vote and weight, and it's valid as such, but it's not, because that's a vote on preference, and that's, again, valid as such, and numbers matter, but it does not change justification status. You see what I'm saying?
Well, it depends on how you interpret preference. You know, Bentley just joined, and we had a conversation a while back where we're talking about, you know, a preference argument is just a statement of, can be restated as a matter of fact. You know, it is a fact that I would benefit from this, or I think I would benefit from this. And that ultimately is just one datum.
Yeah, this is a form of utilitarianism.
Do what?
It's a form of utilitarianism.
Oh, utilitarianism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, not necessarily. You know, you can have a completely non-utilitarian ideology, and somebody says, I believe this, or I prefer this, and someone else counters, well, me and other people prefer that. And now you got to decide, you know, how you weigh all that information.
And this is, but what I'm saying is, this is where this weighing is not about justified or not justified. It's about, like, and again, even in the statement, if we translate them to statement of facts, this benefits me, this is trivially true, and saying, well, this other thing benefits me more doesn't
I think that is,
undermine the validity of you saying this benefits you, right?
But I think the same rules of argument still apply. You know, if somebody says, hey, we should do this, and then somebody argues, hey, look, here's the reason we shouldn't do this, it hurts me. And at that point, if people haven't considered that argument, and if it's just one person, you might by default think, well, that's a weak argument, but we can't make those assumptions, right? That person might be representative of a large group that would be harmed by this. And so I would still say that once someone has made that argument, until that argument has been acknowledged and people say, okay, it hurts you, I'm going to change my vote, or yes, it hurts you, but here's why we should do it anyways, or I'm not going to change my vote. The opinion's not justified until that argument has been responded to.
And respondent on Socrates would simply say, like, saying, yes, I believe that's true, it hurts her or not, essentially. And both are valid, doesn't matter.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I'm a bit, I want to separate preference and belief and justification. I think they have distinct mechanisms, but I need to make a more cogent argument about why and how.
Yeah, it's bigger, because then I mean, preference can stem from many things. It can be a combination of, oh, the overall evidence still points at something. It can be like, oh, but this other one clearly shows that, well, that one is more relevant, or it can be so many things.
What I'm saying is, I do agree in the case of arguments, if I make a counter argument to a belief, I create a duty for you to justify why you disagree, if you still do. Whereas if I say, I prefer this to that, I create no such duty. It's like, I can prefer that, you can prefer that, and there's no duty of justification. You see what I'm saying? There may be a duty of justification of why should we follow me rather than you, and that's another argument. But it's another argument. But what I say, I haven't created the burden of proof on you by saying I prefer this. Unlike counter arguments.
Simply making, I mean, just simply saying the world is round hasn't created a burden of proof on anyone until you use that claim as a premise of an argument. When you say we should do this because the world is round.
No, what I'm saying is, if you say, I believe this, and then I say, this is not true because I've created a burden of proof. It's when there's misalignment of belief and arguments. That's when I create a burden of proof. But if you say, I want this, and I say, I want something else, I am not creating a burden of proof.
Well, you're gonna
Yeah,
have
I
to
mean,
argue why. You can
Yeah,
still
you-
say, well, because this other thing is more important. Why wouldn't that be an argument?
Yeah,
And I
a
would
burden of
argue that's an argument
justification, not
against
necessarily
relevance.
proof.
Sorry?
What?
I would say there's a burden of justification,
Yeah.
not proof.
And I'm saying that's essentially different.
But maybe what I need to define more concretely what you're saying. If somebody's saying we should, go to the beach, and you're saying I don't like the beach, as an argument why we shouldn't go to the beach, you're saying you haven't created a burden of justification for why we should go to the beach. But I say you have. I need to now say why I think we should go to the beach, even though you don't like it.
Yes. That is correct. That is correct. In the case of a joint decision, we've created a burden of justification. That's fair. What I'm saying is, if trying to find a good counterexample. Okay, I'll think about counterexamples. I still think they exist, but I admit that I need to think more about your argument.
So, Stephen, maybe backing up a bit, I think you've got the idea that if the argument tree is canonicalized so that irrelevant arguments and duplicate arguments are removed, you now have done the subjective bit. Obviously, deciding that these are bad, irrelevant, duplicate arguments is subjective, and you need some sort of curation process for that.
Well, I would argue, as long as it's subjective enough, they are arguments in their own merit, which will lead to this metric working the way I see it. If it's not subjective, then there's consensus and they're removed essentially.
Well, say that again.
If it's too subjective, if there's no consensus on something being relevant or not, that leads into this metric of this thing being discussed one way or the other. If there's consensus, it's irrelevant. It is not included in the metric. It's an irrelevant argument.
If there's consensus that it's irrelevant.
Exactly.
And that consensus, of course, comes from votes. So you're saying that there's votes on the terminal node.
There's votes on any node, and for me, relevance are claims.
So in my mental model, I'm still trying to consolidate with yours, is one where we're doing some sort of computation about how well justified a claim is or how strong an argument is. And we're taking into consideration the data we have is a combination of votes and the mere presence of arguments, and how those two interact is something I've been thinking about a lot. In those examples I talked about where there's 10 arguments, but all submitted by one person versus each person submits a separate argument versus one argument that gets 10 votes. I feel like that those are important questions to answer. What happens in those situations? And I'm still not clear how you think about that. It sounds like you think. And
I only look at the content. The person submitting it doesn't matter. Either these are 10 valid separate arguments or not.
But that would be based on votes, according to you.
Whether they are separate arguments or not. Whether they're each individually relevant, yes.
I mean, how that data is treated, how's that going to work? Maybe you can, let's take the first example. One person submits 10 arguments. And so now what do we do from there? How do we evaluate that data? Do we still need additional subjective input?
Yeah, so for me, it starts out like neutral, right? If you don't have any data one way or the other, it's literally neutral. You have no data. You cannot say it's healthy or unhealthy. It's only once people start saying this is irrelevant or I believe in this, that's when you can start having metrics.
Right. But so in this situation, someone's made a claim. One person has made 10 claims in support. And he's the only person that's argued in support. No one's argued in opposition. So what's next?
That means that at this point, the status of the conclusion would be highly populist with a consensus belief. So if you look at the, where is it?
which might not be unhealthy, as the yellow box, which could be
Well,
fine.
I still am arguing it is somewhat unhealthy, and this shows in this use case it definitely is, right? Because you have one person, so you have consensus, but it's all biased towards supporting. So you have it would be rated as populist, which is a bit weird if it's only one person, but yeah.
Yeah, so now let's take the case where there's two people, one for and against, one against. The person for submitted those 10 arguments and the person against submitted one argument. How do you evaluate that?
So it will be neutral in this case.
But I thought you were counting the number of arguments and not the number of votes.
That's it. It's
Both.
neutral on the number of votes, so on the vertical axis, but it's biased towards supporting arguments. Exactly.
So the consensus is neutral, but it's biased towards supporting arguments.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say in that case, I wouldn't see in my evaluation, I would say the fact that one person submitted 10 arguments versus one argument doesn't provide us with useful information. Just a stylistic choice. One person, they could have made those 10 arguments in just one long argument.
Okay, yeah, but that has to do with canonicality indeed.
But then, right, but there we need subjectivity on, and that's what I don't understand is how you.
It's one of the reasons why I don't allow compound arguments to be added. I only allow adding atomic arguments.
I think it's possible to have a non-subjective question about the independence of components of an argument. Can these arguments be separated? That is evaluatable by somebody in good faith. What the difference it makes, by the way, and I think that's really where it becomes the rubber hits the road, is if you want to be consistent, that is, you want to refuse the arguments against you, do you want to refute 1 or 10 arguments? And the question of independence is if somebody has crunched 10 arguments into one, does refuting one refute the other? And that's exactly the question of independence. If it's a disjunction, well, you have to do 10 refutation. And then they should have been made independent and they should be refactored to be independent. If it's a conjunction, however, refuting any member refutes the argument, and then no, it's perfectly valid that they're conjunct.
And if you don't have the formalizations in place, and all you know is that one person wrote these 10 different things, you have no data to know whether they're independent or dependent, right? And they could be dependent in different ways. They could be complete duplicates. They could be what's called in argumentation theory a linked argument, where any one of them being true adds very little, has little relevance, but for some reason, all 10 of them being true, a trivial example, the argument is, all 10 of us want to go to the beach. And argument 1 is Joe wants to go to the beach and Ben wants to go to the beach, right? And if all 10 of them are true, then it's inevitable, so they're definitely dependent. And then they could be completely statistically independent. That's a third case where they each kind of add weight by themselves, and you can use like a naive Bayes filter to kind of calculate, what the contribution of all of them is. But the thing is, in this case, we don't have any data except for that one person, has, and so the way I think of it in this case is that there's one justified supporting opinion, supporting vote, and one justified opposing vote. And that to me is data. It's obviously subjective. And if there are trolls and fake accounts involved, it has little value. But if there's a group of people that you at least have some reason to trust, especially if it's a closed organization or a social network where votes are limited to people in your social network, obviously there's the echo chamber issue, or there's a forum that does a great job of getting rid of bots and trolls, then the subjective vote means something. And I haven't found a way to get away from subjectivity ultimately, whether it's deciding what's relevant, deciding what's canonical.
I don't think that's possible. No.
And so I see those two in terms of evidence for both sides of the argument as being identical. And that's that actually recognizing that was a big breakthrough for me. I think that's very significant. At least making that assumption in the work I'm doing really has simplified and things and kind of broken open the door to actually creating a reasonable algorithm for this this justified opinion calculation.
By the way, I still think there are cases where the distinction happens, but I'm conceding the point in general about you're still creating a burden of justification. See, what I wanted to say is, let's say, I want to go to the mountain, you want to go to the beach, classic example. You saying you want to go to the beach doesn't make me unjustified to want to go to the mountain. However, it does make me unjustified to say we should both go to the mountain.
Yes. Yep.
But there is still a distinction. It does not invalidate me. It does not unjustify my preference.
Right. Yep. Yep. And if I, for example, were to make a argument against the premise that you want to go to the mountain, and say no, you don't. You're just saying that to be difficult, right?
Which could be an argument, yes.
Right, yeah.
And then we have burden of proof, obviously.
Yep.
That's a separate case. So, sorry, I just wanted to wrap that up because I did say I think more about it than I did.
I'm still interested in hearing more examples where you're arguing that you can only add supporting argument or opposing arguments, essentially, where the assumption that Bentley correctly pointed out in Hangouts we started earlier with.
That I have conceded that point totally. Oh, sorry. Maybe I misunderstood.
I don't think you have like examples where you can only add supporting arguments. There's nothing in opposition to be said, or vice versa.
My point is not that there's nothing to be said. That's not even something I'm proposing. What I'm saying is there's the arguments on one side are obviously ludicrous, irrelevant, and nobody will bother putting them in, or obvious and nobody will bother putting them in. What I'm saying is we'll be dealing with people putting arguments at need when, and that's why I'm thinking absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I'm not saying that there's no argument that could be put. I'm saying
okay,
that
but
there's no argument that
from that perspective, what I'm saying is if somebody feels a need to add a supporting argument, in what case is it bad to then surface a need to add an opposing argument for the conversation to be healthy? Because that's what we're talking about.
I think, so you're asking, I wouldn't say it's bad necessarily. There's cases where it would be bad to make a counter or an opposing argument. I think there's cases where it's simply unnecessary. People won't do it. Again, the case of a common myth or common misconception, someone, a simple error in reasoning, and you say, I agree with everything you say, you just, it's not true because this math equation is wrong, or this datum is wrong, right? And in that case, that final counter argument might be totally uncontested. And it might be that everyone agrees, and basically the relevance is totally uncontested. Everyone agrees, oh yeah, if what you see about the datum being wrong is true, then obviously this claim is false, and no one's going to argue against that. Now, I'm not saying it would be unhealthy for people to do sort of a devil's advocate argument, but in many situations, people just won't see value in that.
I think there can be negative value in some cases. in the sense that it is about propagating misinformation in some cases. I don't want the misinformation will be put on the platform. And when it's nobody believes it, why give it more visibility just because we feel the need to expose both sides of an argument and play devil's advocate? Is that helping?
Wouldn't
Or
be,
is that,
in
or
this
is
case,
that
it wouldn't be more
propagating
visibility,
disinformation?
right? It would give more good visibility to the healthy. It's to make it seem less populist, essentially, in the terminology that I introduced before. Like, why would you want to make it seem less populist? Well, because then it looks healthy, so it becomes. But yeah,
What I'm saying is I don't know if people will understand that measure of health versus the people who will take the bogus counter arguments at face value. And I'm not sure where the overall social value lies.
Yeah, so the assumption is if somebody adds an obvious, yeah, I need to think about it. It would still be nice to have a really concrete example, because like which myth, right? Because most myths, there's more to it. There's some reason to believe in the myth, and then it would be fairly easy to say it's not a myth.
I was thinking recently about a blockchain price data, right? Somebody says, okay, here's the claim. This is the price of the US dollar on this date. Everyone agrees with it. The reason they agreed with it is because they all pulled that information from the same API.
Yeah.
And the API had an error, right? And one person makes one counter argument, and the data is like totally obviously wrong if you look at it, but people didn't really look at it. Someone makes a counter argument and said, okay, the price is $0. This is obviously wrong. The API was broken. Here's a blog from the company that made the API. Here's the corrected data that they published. I think there's an example where, it's so clear that everyone was wrong. It's so clear that this counter argument is correct, that it's going to be 100% agreement in those that see the counter argument, 100% of agreement in the claim made by the counter argument is true, and that it's totally relevant. And that it means that the original consensus opinion is wrong.
I'm just sketching to make it a bit more. Yeah, I'll think on it. It might be true. Then my next question still is, how common is that? Because these are very uncommon claims, in my opinion, where it is so final as the API call, etc. Like from real world discussion.
Well, maybe that's a topic for next time, but I better run.
Okay, see you next time.
See you next time. It's a good conversation. Thank you all.
Yeah, it was super interesting. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.